Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, we bring you a true story, one that will creep into your thoughts long after you've closed your eyes. I want you to imagine the dense, rolling hills of North Carolina in the late summer of 1929. The sun is low, spilling golden light across the slopes, and a quiet fog begins to drift over the mountain ridges, curling around the homesteads like a whisper. In one such isolated place, a family called Lawson lived, seemingly ordinary, tucked away from the world, their lives a tapestry of routine, labor, and quiet hope. But as we will see, darkness sometimes arrives on the softest of evenings, in a form we could never anticipate. The Lawson household was the kind that, at a glance, radiated comfort. A modest farmhouse with whitewashed walls, a small porch where morning sunlight would touch the wooden floorboards, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of bread and preserves. Inside, the family of five moved through their days with quiet rhythm. Mr. Lawson, a man of routine and stoicism, tended to the fields and livestock. Mrs. Lawson managed the household with an exacting, gentle diligence. Their three children, 2 girls and a boy, played in the yard, exploring the edges of the forest, their laughter ringing through the valley in carefree arcs. It was a world that felt safe, almost impermeable, yet it held within it the seed of unspeakable tragedy. On that evening, the air carried the first whispers of fall, a soft chill brushing against the skin, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The family dined together, a small meal of vegetables, bread, and tea, the children's chatter filling the corners of the kitchen. But there was a subtle tension in the air, one that perhaps only a careful observer might notice. A fleeting glance, a hesitated word, a shadow that seemed to linger just a moment too long. And then, as night gathered like a cloak around the farmhouse, silence fell, deep and heavy. The hills themselves seemed to lean in, listening. No one knew at that moment that the quiet night would become a stage for horror. Outside, the forest pressed close, its edges darkening, a labyrinth of trees and undergrowth that held secrets older than the town itself. Somewhere beyond the farm, someone moved with purpose. Methodical, deliberate, a shadow merging into the night. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of wind through the pines, the muted snapping of a twig, each sound almost imperceptible, yet somehow more pronounced in the hush of the evening. By the time the moon rose, pale and hesitant, the first signs of disturbance had appeared. Doors left slightly ajar, a window unlatched, footprints pressed into the soft soil leading toward the backwoods. These were tiny, almost insignificant details, yet they bore a story that would unfold only in the cold light of morning. In the quiet of the Lawson home, the family slept unaware, their breaths shallow, their lives unknowingly on the brink of rupture. A strange fact about this night is that isolated families were often at higher risk in rural communities like this in the 1920s. Without immediate neighbors or rapid communication, any intrusion or violent act could proceed undetected for hours. Scholars debate how these conditions shaped both crime patterns and investigative strategies in early 20th century America. In the Lawson case, this combination of isolation, silence, and opportunity proved tragically significant. Imagine, if you will, the soft hush of the farmhouse at 2 a.m., the only sound, the faint tick of a clock, and the occasional rustle from the animals in the barn. And then, almost imperceptibly, a presence shifts in the shadows. Perhaps it is the killer, moving carefully, ensuring that nothing is disturbed, nothing draws attention. In the silence, even the faintest sound is amplified, a creak in the floorboards, the sigh of a settling house. These were the final hours before discovery, a night of unspeakable intrusion into an otherwise ordinary life. Before we step further into this story, if you're drawn to the eerie tension of hidden danger and the fragile boundary between normalcy and horror, like and subscribe. but only if you wish to experience the slow, deliberate unfolding of dark truths. And while you listen, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's fascinating to imagine these events reaching across decades and miles, connecting us through curiosity and contemplation. By dawn, the first light seeped into the valley, revealing the unthinkable. The Lawson family, once vibrant and whole, had been violently silenced. Details of the scene are chilling, yet remain PG-13 in their telling. Overturned chairs, signs of struggle, and the presence of an intruder's path through the home. The evidence of the attack is subtle in its horror, the kind that lodges quietly in your mind rather than screaming in sight. Investigators would later note the methodical nature of the crime, how carefully it was executed, how deeply the family's trust in their isolated world was violated. Neighbors, drawn by unusual silence and the distant barking of dogs, arrived to discover the aftermath. Their shock was palpable, a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and mounting fear. In small towns, everyone knew each other's routines. Disruptions like this left communities rattled to their core. People whispered in hushed tones, sharing fragmented reports, struggling to reconcile the ordinary morning with the extraordinary horror. The investigation would begin here, in the soft light of a North Carolina dawn, where the beauty of the landscape was juxtaposed against the grim reality of human malice. Patterns would emerge, clues would be followed, and the psychological puzzle of motive and opportunity would slowly take shape. But in these first hours, all was raw, immediate, and profoundly unsettling. The Lawson family, the quiet farmhouse, the surrounding hills, everything became a stage for a narrative that would ripple outward through time, marking both the community and the broader history of crime in America. The night of the tragedy was, in retrospect, both ordinary and catastrophic. It reminds us that horror can arrive in silence, that isolation can be both comforting and dangerous, and that the ordinary world often conceals shadows we are unprepared to confront. The Lawson case would soon demand attention, careful observation, and relentless pursuit of truth. A journey that would stretch over days, weeks, and months, each step revealing more about human darkness and the resilience required to face it. The morning after the tragedy, the valley seemed to hold its breath. Mist lingered low among the hills, weaving through trees and clinging to the damp earth, as though the landscape itself mourned. I want you to imagine walking slowly up the narrow dirt road leading to the Lawson homestead, the sound of your boots muted by the thick blanket of fog. Neighbors had begun to gather, whispers spreading like smoke, each step forward carrying a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. When the first onlookers reached the house, the scene inside was both eerily quiet and profoundly unsettling. Chairs were scattered unevenly across the kitchen floor, the morning light illuminating overturned dishes and the faint imprint of hurried movement. Nothing overtly grotesque met the eye, no splashes of blood in the open, but the subtle signs of struggle and forced intrusion were enough to set every heart racing. Small things drew attention. A footprint pressed into the soft kitchen dust, a doorknob twisted slightly more than it should have been, a curtain fluttering oddly as though disturbed by invisible hands. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, unable to reconcile the familiar warmth of the Lawson home with the presence of menace. "Something's terribly wrong," one whispered, her voice trembling. "I just know it." Another nodded, staring at the scattered belongings, the faint glint of a broken pane catching the light. And in that quiet, the first realization began to take hold. This was no ordinary disturbance, no simple misfortune. Something far darker had occurred here. The children's room was perhaps the hardest to face. Their small beds, still neatly made, offered an almost painful contrast to the violence that had clearly occurred. Toys lay scattered, some in the shadows, some under furniture, and the sense of innocence violated hung heavy in the air. In the soft morning light, even the smallest detail, A book left open, a doll facing the wall, seemed charged with haunting significance. The observers could almost feel the echo of the children's last breaths, frozen in memory, the silence deafening in its weight. Investigators arrived soon after, moving through the scene with deliberate care. Each motion was precise, controlled, as they began cataloging evidence in a way that was methodical yet somehow reverent, given the magnitude of what had occurred. They photographed footprints, the alignment of furniture, the faint abrasions on door frames and floors, subtle marks, the kind that only a trained eye could interpret as traces of human presence and intention. The air seemed to grow colder as they worked, a reminder that the house, once a haven, had been transformed into a site of inquiry and suspicion. A strange fact about the early discovery is that forensic methodology in 1929 was rudimentary by today's standards. Yet investigators still relied heavily on careful observation, witness statements, and pattern recognition. Scholars debate how much early procedural techniques impacted case outcomes, but in situations like the Lawson murders, every small observation mattered. The tilt of a chair, the placement of objects, the faint traces left by a perpetrator's haste or care. Here, these tiny clues would become the foundation for unraveling a complex and disturbing mystery. Outside, the crowd grew restless. Families leaned on fences, craning to catch glimpses of what investigators found, their faces pale with apprehension. The town, once confident in the safety of its secluded homesteads, now buzzed with uncertainty. Each whispered theory added tension. A traveling stranger, a long-held grudge, or perhaps something stranger still. The collective anxiety of the community was almost tangible, pressing against the thin walls of the house as if the building itself absorbed their fear. Inside, the sheriff and his deputies worked quietly but efficiently, moving from room to room. They noted minor disturbances. A cupboard left ajar, the slight scuffing on floorboards, each small irregularity adding to the growing tapestry of evidence. No clear explanation yet emerged, but the pattern suggested both familiarity and planning. Whoever had done this knew the house, or at least moved with confident purpose. The tension lay not only in what had occurred, but in the lurking knowledge that the culprit had not yet been seen or caught, still free in the surrounding hills. Before we continue this story, if you're following every subtle detail and quiet shift, like and subscribe, but only if you wish to step deeper into the slow, measured unfolding of true crime. And while you're here, share with me where you're listening from and the hour on your clock. It's fascinating how these echoes of fear and investigation can reach across decades and geography. One of the investigators, carefully noting the angle of displaced furniture, murmured to his colleague about the methodical nature of the intrusion. "Notice how nothing is broken unnecessarily," he said. "It's almost as if they wanted to leave a message or to show control." In moments like this, patterns began to emerge. Subtle yet chilling signs that the attack was not random. There was a rhythm to the chaos, an intentional disruption that spoke of psychological complexity. And this observation would guide the investigation for months to come. Neighbors and townsfolk continued to gather outside, some bringing blankets, others simply lingering, unsure how to process the horror. Children peeked cautiously from behind their parents, sensing that something had changed in the world. The once familiar woods surrounding the farm seemed darker, more foreboding. Every rustle of leaves or distant crow called attention to the uncertainty and fear now saturating the valley. Life, which had once flowed easily along quiet dirt roads, now carried a tremor of suspicion. As forensic officers worked through the homestead, they found traces that suggested the killer had spent deliberate time inside. A small, faint smudge on the pantry door, footprints pressed in dust, and objects slightly shifted from their normal positions. Each element hinted at careful observation and the manipulation of space, not just violence, but calculated control. The psychological profile began to emerge in the detectives' minds, a sketch of a figure capable of cold precision and meticulous planning. By the end of the morning, the story of the Lawson murders had begun to take shape, though many questions remained unanswered. Who could commit such an act? How had they accessed the home unnoticed? What drove them to target this family? Every neighbor, every investigator, every whispering observer became part of the unfolding narrative, their collective awareness entwined with the details of the crime. The discovery at the homestead marked the beginning of a journey through fear, curiosity, and methodical inquiry. The Lawson family's lives, once filled with ordinary rhythms, had been shattered, leaving behind both physical and psychological traces. As we proceed further into this story, we will follow the investigators, the evidence, and the subtle clues that would eventually lead to understanding the who, how, and why, all while maintaining the quiet, unsettling tone that allows us to witness horror without being consumed by it. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing the Lawson homestead in full, stark clarity. From the ridge above, the valley stretched outward, a quilt of trees and farmland, yet nothing in its serene appearance betrayed the horror that had unfolded hours before. I want you to imagine walking along the narrow road toward the farmhouse, the air damp with mist and the silence punctuated only by distant crows and the soft rustling of leaves. The quiet was unsettling, as though the world itself hesitated, unwilling to breathe too loudly, afraid to disturb the fragile boundary between ordinary life and the chaos of violence. The sheriff, a steady man named Weaver, began the initial investigation with measured precision. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he moved from room to room, eyes sharp, voice low, directing his deputies to take note of every detail. He was meticulous, aware that in cases like these, the smallest observation could unlock a crucial piece of the puzzle. A doorknob slightly twisted, a chair nudged out of place, the faint residue of mud along the floorboards, all told a story, a whisper of the intruder's path through the home. Inside, the air was thick with the lingering scent of disruption, overturned furniture, the faint odor of smoke from the fireplace, and something subtler, almost metallic, that hinted at violence. Investigators documented everything, sketching diagrams of the rooms, photographing footprints, and measuring the angles of displaced objects. Each action felt deliberate, a slow ritual that contrasted sharply with the suddenness of the crime itself. In these early hours, the house seemed to breathe around them, every creak and groan a reminder of the living world still pressing against the unnatural silence left in the family's absence. Neighbors hovered near the edges of the property, drawn by curiosity and a shared sense of unease. Some carried blankets or small offerings. Others simply watched, wide-eyed, unsure how to process the reality they were witnessing. One woman, her hands trembling, whispered to another, "It's as if the night itself brought evil here." There was truth in her words, for in remote rural communities, isolation amplifies fear. The hills that usually provided comfort now seemed like sentinels, silent witnesses to the incomprehensible. A strange fact about early investigations in the 1920s is that evidence collection relied heavily on human observation and memory. Photography was limited, and forensic techniques lacked the sophistication we take for granted today. Scholars debate how much this affected outcomes, but in the Lawson case, the careful scrutiny of minor details, scuffed floors, small traces of mud, subtle irregularities in furniture placement, proved invaluable. Every faint sign contributed to the slowly forming picture of the crime, and the investigators knew that missing even a small clue could mean letting the perpetrator slip away. Sheriff Weaver began his interviews with those closest to the family. Friends, neighbors, and even the local mail carrier were asked about the Lawsons' routines, their visitors, and any peculiar behaviors noticed in recent weeks. One neighbor mentioned seeing a figure near the edge of the woods a few nights prior, someone moving quietly, as if watching, but too fleetingly to identify. Another recalled hearing the faint sound of someone walking on the roof late one evening, but dismissed it as the wind. These scattered observations began to coalesce into a framework for understanding the timeline and the perpetrator's possible habits. Inside the house, the children's room remained a haunting tableau. Small toys lay where they had been left, but subtle disturbances suggested that someone had passed through, carefully, almost reverently, before the violence erupted. The juxtaposition of innocence and intrusion was stark, and it seemed to weigh on every investigator and neighbor who entered the space. Each object, each misaligned item, was a piece of a puzzle that demanded patience and attention, a slow reconstruction of events that no one wanted to confront in full. Before we go further, if the slow unveiling of truth, detail by meticulous detail, keeps your mind awake and your curiosity sharpened, like and subscribe, only if you wish to step into the quiet, deliberate process of unraveling real horror. And as you listen, share where you are and the hour of the day on your clock. It's remarkable to think these events, decades old, still resonate across time and distance. The sheriff's team began mapping the homestead and surrounding property. Every window, door, and path was examined, footprints measured, and mud patterns traced. They noted the subtle differences in pressure on the floorboards, the way certain objects were nudged or tilted, and the faint impressions in the soil outside. All of this suggested both familiarity and careful calculation, a perpetrator who had moved with purpose, aware of the house's layout and its inhabitants' habits. The thought that someone could navigate so quietly, so deliberately, through the spaces of life and home was profoundly disturbing. Community members contributed what they could, offering accounts of unusual visitors or strange occurrences. One man reported seeing a wagon parked on a hill near the edge of the property late at night, though he was unsure if it had any relation to the crime. Another woman mentioned hearing voices in the darkness that she initially attributed to children playing, yet in hindsight felt that something more sinister had passed through the air. These recollections, although fragmentary, provided subtle hints that would guide investigators in understanding the timing, behavior, and psychology of the perpetrator. By midday, the investigation had begun to reveal patterns. The house itself told a story: which rooms had been entered first, how the intruder had moved from space to space, and which areas were left untouched. Small details, almost invisible to an untrained eye, pointed to a mind that was deliberate, organized, and potentially familiar with the Lawson family's routines. The investigators began to sketch profiles, considering motives, opportunities, and behaviors, a careful dance between observation, deduction, and intuition. The town, now fully awake to the horror, felt both protective and fearful. Markets were quieter, streets emptier, and conversations hushed. Families clung closer to one another, the invisible thread of fear woven tightly through the community. In those early hours, as Sheriff Weaver and his deputies combed through evidence, the ripple of terror extended beyond the homestead, touching every heart and mind in the valley. As night approaches in our story, remember that each small detail recorded in these first hours, each whispered account, and each trace of movement would ultimately play a role in solving the mystery. The careful, measured work of investigators, combined with the subtle testimony of neighbors and the town itself, was the beginning of a path that would eventually reveal the truth behind the Lawson family murders. In every corner, every shadow, the story was waiting to be read, one deliberate step at a time. The investigation began to expand beyond the walls of the Lawson home. The surrounding woods, dense and shadowed, became a focal point for detectives and townsfolk alike. Imagine walking slowly along the narrow, winding paths through thick undergrowth, the air damp with morning mist and the scent of decaying leaves heavy in the nose. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of a small animal fleeing unseen, seemed amplified, almost like the woods themselves were aware of the recent intrusion and now held their breath. Sheriff Weaver led a small team into the forest, carefully examining the terrain for any trace of the intruder. They noted depressions in the soft earth, the occasional bent branch, and faint footprints pressed into the damp soil. Each observation told a story, a path followed, hesitation, or perhaps a misstep. The details were subtle but crucial. The intruder had moved deliberately, cautiously avoiding detection, yet the earth always left whispers, if one knew how to read them. Neighbors joined in sporadically, offering knowledge of the terrain. "There's a hollow just over that ridge," one man said, pointing with a shaking hand. "I've never seen anyone go there at night, but sometimes strange fires are lit." These small fragments, anecdotal yet persistent, helped investigators map out potential escape routes and hiding places, creating a tentative timeline of the intruder's movements. Even the smallest contributions could mean the difference between clarity and confusion. Inside the house, detectives continued their meticulous cataloging of evidence. Dust patterns, the alignment of chairs and tables, faint smudges on door frames, all suggested how the perpetrator had moved. The precision was alarming. Nothing seemed left to chance. Scholars debate whether such methodical behavior indicates familiarity with the victims or simply a psychological compulsion for control, and the Lawson case offered a chilling study in both. The intruder exercised deliberate control over space, subtly imposing presence without immediate detection. A strange fact is that many violent intrusions in rural America during the 1920s involved minimal physical evidence, relying on the perpetrator's awareness of isolation and absence of immediate witnesses. In the Lawson case, both these factors were present. The forest's shadows, the silence of nearby neighbors, and the time of night all favored an intruder who understood both human behavior and the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Back in the woods, Sheriff Weaver discovered a small clearing, partially hidden by overgrown brush. There, faint signs of human activity suggested temporary occupation. Flattened grass, a few scattered remnants of a fire, and subtle marks on nearby trees. The evidence was circumstantial, yet compelling. Whoever had spent time here had done so cautiously, leaving enough trace to suggest presence, but not enough to provide immediate identification. It was almost as if the forest itself had absorbed these moments, holding them secret until careful eyes came to read the signs. The team also discovered broken twigs and slightly disturbed earth along a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. Each marker suggested deliberate navigation, perhaps a planned exit route, or the perpetrator retracing steps to ensure no trace remained. These details would later be cross-referenced with witness statements and neighborhood accounts, helping to narrow both timing and potential suspects. The investigators' ability to notice minute irregularities was paramount, for one overlooked detail could allow a dangerous individual to vanish into the hills. Before we continue, if you feel the tension rising with each subtle discovery, consider liking and subscribing. Only if the thrill of tracking a methodical intruder across time and space appeals to you. And as you ponder the scene, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. These quiet hours of reflection link us, bridging decades with curiosity and shared attention. Returning to the house, the investigators began cataloging items that might have been moved or handled by the intruder. A cupboard slightly ajar, a chair nudged backward, a curtain pulled aside. small but significant indicators of human behavior in a time when forensic technology was still rudimentary. Each detail reinforced the psychological profile emerging: meticulous, careful, deliberate. The combination of violence and order suggested an individual both capable of cruelty and possessed of self-control, a dangerous duality that would guide investigators' search for motive and identity. The surrounding community remained tense. Conversations in town were hushed, punctuated by glances toward the hills. Every traveler along the main road, every passerby, seemed suspect. Local children avoided the edges of the woods where they had once played freely, and parents called their youngsters back from fields and streams earlier than usual. Fear was an invisible presence, settling over the town like morning fog, shifting subtly yet inescapably through every home and conversation. Investigators began to focus on potential motives. Though the crime was violent, its deliberate execution suggested more than a random act. Was it vengeance, jealousy, opportunism, or a darker, less comprehensible compulsion? Each question was explored cautiously, weighed against physical evidence and witness statements. The psychological dimension of the case became as important as the tangible, for understanding the mind behind the act would be key to preventing further tragedy. As the day wore on, Sheriff Weaver convened a small meeting of key officers. They compared notes on the homestead, the surrounding forest, and the community's recollections. By mapping all observations, a preliminary timeline emerged, suggesting the intruder had approached in darkness, entered the house with careful steps, committed the violent act, and retreated through the woods in a pre-planned path. The methodical reconstruction provided a chilling sense of clarity, revealing how calculated and deliberate the attack had been. The investigators' attention to detail began to pay off. Small inconsistencies in witness accounts, subtle contradictions about sightings, timing, and noises began to clarify rather than confuse. By aligning these fragments with physical evidence, the team created a tentative picture of the intruder's movements. This painstaking work, done at a deliberate pace, illustrates how methodical attention can illuminate truth even in the face of horror. As night approached, the clearing in the woods remained quiet, almost expectant. Shadows deepened, the air cooled, and the forest seemed to hold its breath once more. Every footstep, every whisper of movement was amplified in the hushed, anticipatory quiet. The detectives prepared to continue their search at first light, knowing that each small discovery could bring them closer to understanding the terrifying events that had unfolded in the Lawson homestead. The morning after the initial survey of the Lawson property, the town began to speak more openly. Witness accounts emerged slowly, fragmentary yet unsettling. I want you to imagine standing at the edge of a dusty road, the air cool and still, as neighbors approach cautiously, eyes downcast, their voices hushed. Each person seemed to carry a secret, whether it was something they had seen, heard, or only suspected. Fear and curiosity intertwined, creating a tense, almost electric atmosphere. The first witness, a farmer from a nearby ridge, described seeing a shadow moving near the tree line in the late hours of the night. "It wasn't a man, not exactly," he said, his voice low, trembling slightly. "Just something that moved wrong." While his words were vague, investigators took note. In cases like these, even the seemingly inconsequential observations could reveal patterns. The way the figure moved, the timing of its presence, all became pieces of a larger puzzle. Inside the Lawson home, investigators continued their meticulous documentation. They measured the positions of overturned furniture, photographed subtle marks on the floorboards, and recorded impressions in dust and dirt. Each trace offered insight into the sequence of events. There was no doubt in their minds that the intruder had navigated the house with deliberate intent, touching only what they needed, leaving behind an eerie combination of chaos and control. Every step, every small action, contributed to a psychological profile forming silently in the background of the investigation. Neighbors who had heard noises during the night were interviewed in sequence. One woman recalled faint footsteps along the porch, just enough to disturb the sleeping children, but not enough to wake the adults immediately. Another mentioned hearing voices, low, indistinct murmurs, fading into the darkness. In each account, investigators listened carefully, parsing the tone, timing, and emotional content of every word. These recollections, though subjective, provided a lattice of temporal and spatial data critical to understanding the crime. A strange fact about witness testimony in early 20th century investigations is that memory was often both the greatest resource and the most fragile element. Scholars debate the reliability of recollections under stress, yet in isolated communities like the Lawsons, local knowledge often provided clues that modern forensics might not have immediately revealed. Every whisper of movement, every fleeting glimpse, became a vital piece of evidence when considered collectively. Sheriff Weaver took particular interest in the timing of these sightings. By cross-referencing statements, he began to construct a rough timeline. Someone had approached the house under the cover of darkness, entered carefully, and retreated through the woods along a path now clearly marked by faint but consistent signs of human passage. Each witness added small increments of detail, allowing investigators to map not only the movement, but also possible intentions of the intruder. Outside the house, townsfolk congregated near the sheriff's office, anxiously comparing notes. Rumors began to spread, some rational, others bordering on the fantastic. One man suggested a traveling drifter, someone passing through and acting without personal motive. Another whispered of long-standing grudges within the local community, ideas that would require careful verification. Investigators documented every account, balancing the need for objectivity with the necessity of considering all possibilities. Inside the home, the children's bedroom remained a focal point. Investigators noted the orderliness of the beds and the careful placement of toys, as if the intruder had consciously avoided destroying objects unrelated to their purpose. It was a deliberate mix of violence and restraint, suggesting a level of calculation that both fascinated and disturbed those examining the scene. The subtlety of this behavior revealed much about the intruder's mindset: methodical, controlled, and aware of the psychological impact of their actions. Before we continue, if the tension woven through these early witness accounts holds your attention, like and subscribe. Only if the meticulous unfolding of mystery appeals to you. And while you're listening, tell me your location and the time at your side. Sharing these details makes the quiet journey through past horror feel a little more tangible, connecting us across space and decades. Investigators also noted small physical evidence mentioned by witnesses. Faint traces of soil on the porch, slight disturbances in the garden, and marks on the wooden fence suggesting a point of entry or exit. Though these clues were minimal, they complemented the witness accounts, adding tangible support to the narrative emerging from oral recollections. The interplay between physical and anecdotal evidence was critical, forming a foundation for the next steps of the investigation. The psychological undertone of the case became more pronounced with each account. Witnesses frequently mentioned a feeling of being watched, the sense that an unseen presence lingered in the periphery of vision. In one particularly chilling statement, a local teenager described hearing the sound of someone breathing outside the house at precisely the moment the crime occurred, though no one could confirm the timing. The investigators recorded this carefully, noting its alignment with physical evidence that suggested deliberate, stealthy movements. By afternoon, a tentative profile of the intruder began to emerge. Deliberate, precise, psychologically attuned to fear. Someone capable of planning and executing violence while minimizing evidence. Each witness account, each subtle observation of disturbed property or footprints contributed to this image. Scholars debate whether such early profiling influenced the trajectory of investigations in the 1920s. Yet in the Lawson case, the meticulous cross-referencing of witness testimony and physical evidence proved indispensable. Outside, tension in the community was palpable. Families stayed closer to home, conversations were guarded, and children were kept indoors. The hills and woods, once part of a familiar landscape, now seemed ominous. Shadows carried potential menace, and the sense of vulnerability permeated the air. Even routine sounds, a branch cracking, a distant horse's hoof, were amplified by collective fear. By evening, Sheriff Weaver and his team had begun compiling a master timeline of the night's events. The careful alignment of witness observations, physical evidence, and logical inference began to clarify the sequence of intrusion, violence, and retreat. Each detail, no matter how minor, added a layer of understanding, bringing the investigators closer to identifying patterns that might lead to the perpetrator. The day concluded with a quiet, tense vigilance. Witnesses departed slowly, exchanging uneasy glances and whispered comments. The homestead itself seemed to retain an almost sentient awareness of the events, the stillness of the rooms contrasting sharply with the frenetic thoughts of those outside. In the delicate interplay between observation, recollection, and deduction, the groundwork for unraveling the mystery had been laid. As the investigation advanced, attention shifted toward the people who might have harbored motives, grudges, or opportunity. Early suspicion fell upon neighbors and acquaintances, those familiar with the Lawson family and their routines. I want you to picture sitting quietly in the dimly lit sheriff's office, the ticking of a wall clock the only sound, as officers compile statements and compare details. Each person who walked in seemed ordinary, yet the undercurrent of fear suggested that one among them might be extraordinary in darkness. Sheriff Weaver began questioning neighbors who had close interactions with the family. One man recalled a heated argument near the general store weeks before the murder. Another mentioned that a traveling peddler had been seen lingering near the property on multiple nights. Every statement was cross-checked against witness observations and physical evidence. The process was methodical, slow, like peeling away layers of a dense fog. Each small inconsistency could be significant, potentially illuminating a path toward understanding the crime. Inside the Lawson home, the investigators continued cataloging items that may have been touched or disturbed by the intruder. The subtle smudges on doorknobs, the arrangement of furniture, and the faint soil tracked along the floorboards suggested someone moving with purpose, someone aware of both the house's layout and the timing of family routines. Scholars debate how such observations, when paired with early psychological profiling, can hint at both motive and method. In this case, they painted a picture of calculated intrusion rather than spontaneous violence. A strange fact about the period is that early 20th century law enforcement often relied on community memory and observation in lieu of modern forensic technology. Every passing comment from neighbors, every recollection of a late-night noise or a strange visitor, became a form of evidence. The detectives treated these statements with both caution and respect, aware that memory could be fallible, but that patterns often emerged from collective accounts. By mid-morning, Sheriff Weaver had begun identifying potential suspects. One individual, a former farmhand dismissed months earlier, had a history of disputes with the Lawson family over minor property disagreements. Another, a stranger to the area, had been seen loitering near the woods during the nights in question. Both individuals were approached, their movements and alibis scrutinized carefully. The tension in these encounters was palpable. Every question, every gesture could reveal the slightest hint of guilt or deceit. The team also considered psychological aspects of the suspects. Each person's demeanor under questioning, their willingness to recount events, and subtle physical cues became part of a behavioral profile. The investigators understood that violence of this type is often executed by individuals who are methodical, careful, and attuned to fear itself. The behavior of suspects then offered insight not only into opportunity, but into potential intent. Before we continue, if the slow, deliberate unraveling of potential suspects keeps your attention sharp and curiosity piqued, like and subscribe. Only if the methodical search for truth fascinates you. And while you linger here, tell me where you are listening from and what hour it is for you. These small shared details bridge decades of mystery, letting us confront the past together. Physical evidence also pointed toward the early suspects. Soil samples from the yard, impressions on the porch, and disturbances along the property line were all cross-referenced with the footprints and marks linked to potential individuals. Though rudimentary compared to modern forensics, these observations offered valuable hints. Patterns began to emerge. One path in particular, leading from the edge of the woods to a seldom-used side entrance, matched both the timeline and reported sightings. Conversations with the local community continued, revealing additional context about possible motives. A neighbor mentioned ongoing disputes over livestock. Another referenced rumors of hidden debts or jealousy. Investigators carefully weighed each anecdote, distinguishing between actionable intelligence and local gossip. The balance between suspicion and fact was delicate, and each piece of information had to be verified against the growing body of evidence. Inside the house, attention remained on the subtle psychological traces left by the intruder. Items had been moved, yet not destroyed. Doors were opened, yet not forcibly broken. Small acts of intimidation, careful and deliberate, painted a chilling portrait of control and awareness. The investigators noted how the perpetrator had manipulated space, perhaps to heighten fear or maintain dominance over the household. It was a careful orchestration, a quiet terror embedded in the everyday. By afternoon, the first formal interrogations took place. The former farmhand, a wiry man with wary eyes, was brought in for questioning. Sheriff Weaver maintained a calm, unhurried tone, asking about his movements, acquaintances, and feelings toward the Lawson family. Every answer was carefully recorded, every hesitation noted. The subtle tension in the room was palpable, like walking along a narrow ridge, aware that a single misstep could lead to disaster. Simultaneously, the stranger observed near the woods was located and questioned. His account was vague, though not immediately suspicious. Officers noted inconsistencies in timing, movements, and familiarity with the terrain, marking them for further investigation. The deliberate pace of the questioning mirrored the methodical nature of the crime itself, measured, precise, and unwavering. Scholars of criminal psychology often debate the influence of early profiling on rural homicide investigations. In the Lawson case, this approach allowed Sheriff Weaver to focus attention on individuals who exhibited both opportunity and potential motive, narrowing the field without assuming guilt prematurely. Each observation, every cross-reference between accounts, and all physical evidence contributed to a slowly emerging portrait of the perpetrator. As evening fell, the town seemed to exhale cautiously, the tension of the day leaving subtle tremors in every household. Families locked doors earlier than usual, shadows grew longer and more menacing, and conversations carried an unspoken awareness of the recent horror. The psychological landscape of the community had shifted, fear lingered, precise and patient, like the investigators themselves, moving silently through the details of the case. By nightfall, a tentative picture of potential suspects was emerging. Patterns of movement, motive, and behavior suggested that the intruder was someone capable of both calculation and subtle terror. The detectives prepared to consolidate their findings, anticipating that the next steps would require careful observation, methodical comparison of evidence, and a patient, deliberate approach to uncovering the truth hidden in the shadows. The following morning brought a quiet intensity to the sheriff's office. Conflicting alibis began to surface, twisting the investigation into a web of uncertainty. I want you to imagine sitting on a creaking wooden chair, leaning forward as officers shuffle papers, whispering about who said what and when. The room smells faintly of ink, wood polish, and the dampness that seeps in from the outside air. Every sound seems louder than it should, a subtle amplification that mirrors the tension settling over the investigation. First, the former farmhand's story began to unravel. He claimed to have been visiting relatives during the night of the murders, yet minor discrepancies appeared when his account was compared to neighbors' observations. The timeline he provided did not entirely coincide with reported noises, sightings, and physical evidence collected from the Lawson property. Small inconsistencies, slightly different times, vague descriptions, uncertain locations began to suggest either deception or memory lapses. Investigators recorded each contradiction carefully, aware that even minor details could become pivotal. At the same time, the stranger observed near the woods offered an alibi. He had been working at a local mill during the hours of the crime. Several mill workers corroborated this claim, but their accounts were less precise than one would hope. Some only remembered seeing him early in the evening or later in the night, and no one could account for the entire period during which the murders occurred. This partial confirmation created tension among the sheriff's team. If true, it removed him from immediate suspicion, but the gaps left room for doubt. Witness statements continued to provide context, albeit confusing at times. One neighbor mentioned seeing a figure near the edge of the property just after midnight, while another claimed to hear faint sounds of movement closer to 1 a.m. The exact timing was difficult to reconcile, given the limits of human memory and the quiet, isolated environment. Scholars debate whether such inconsistencies are inevitable in high-stress circumstances or whether they might signal deliberate obfuscation by those involved. In the Lawson case, both possibilities seemed plausible. The investigators began mapping the timeline with painstaking detail. By aligning each alibi with observed footprints, disturbed foliage, and residual signs of movement around the house, patterns began to emerge. Each overlap, each mismatch offered subtle clues. Even the smallest observation, like the placement of a tool near the porch or the angle of a partially closed door, was examined for alignment with known witness statements. The work was slow, meticulous, and mentally exhausting, but it was necessary to avoid misdirection in such a delicate case. A strange fact about early forensic work is that detectives often relied on careful observation of environmental traces, including soil displacement, minor abrasions on surfaces, and faint impressions in grass or mud. In rural cases, where modern forensic science was absent, these subtle cues could make the difference between identifying the perpetrator and letting them vanish into the woods. In the Lawson investigation, every minuscule detail was recorded, measured, and compared with suspect accounts. The tension within the sheriff's office became palpable as officers debated the credibility of each story. The farmhand's nervous glances, the stranger's measured responses, and the subtle body language of others being interviewed contributed to a psychological assessment that would guide the investigation. Even minor gestures, a hesitation before speaking, an unsteady breath, or avoidance of eye contact, were noted and factored into evolving hypotheses. Before we proceed further, if the web of conflicting stories draws you deeper into the unsettling complexity of this case, like and subscribe, but only if the slow unraveling of human behavior fascinates you. And while you're here, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you. the quiet hours of your night mirror the tension of this unfolding investigation. As the day wore on, detectives revisited the property for additional context. The garden, porch, and woods were scrutinized once again, this time with the timeline of the alibis in mind. Investigators traced each suspected path, measuring distances and evaluating feasibility. Could the farmhand have arrived unnoticed, committed the crime, and returned to the alibi location? Could the stranger have slipped away from the mill unnoticed? The methodical reconstruction of events, step by step, allowed the team to visualize possible scenarios and eliminate impossible ones. Interviewing additional neighbors provided more contradictions. Some recalled seeing lights flicker in the Lawson house later than the previously reported time of the attack. Others described faint movement behind curtains or shadows that lingered longer than seemed natural. Each fragment of information added both clarity and confusion, making the task of determining the truth increasingly intricate. The challenge was to weave a coherent narrative from imperfect and conflicting recollections. Investigators also began considering motives in tandem with opportunity. Minor disputes, rumors of property conflicts, jealousy, and resentment all formed a lattice of potential explanations. They had to determine whether the perpetrator acted out of personal grievance, random malice, or some other compulsion. The subtle interplay between motive and opportunity would later be critical in narrowing the suspect list and building a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. Within the home, the residual psychological traces of the crime were reviewed. Furniture placement, subtle traces of movement, and signs of intentional disturbance suggested premeditation. The intruder had not acted in pure anger or frenzy. Instead, a deliberate, controlled approach indicated planning and forethought. Scholars note that careful observation of such details in historical cases can illuminate the mindset of criminals long before modern profiling existed. By evening, the investigation had begun to consolidate around a smaller group of individuals. The conflicting alibis revealed who could not have committed the crime, and the remaining uncertainties highlighted those who required closer scrutiny. Each minute detail, timing, behavior, environmental evidence was examined within a slow, deliberate process, ensuring that no step was skipped in pursuit of understanding. The day closed with quiet anticipation. The sheriff and his team, methodical and patient, prepared for a second round of interrogations. The conflicting alibis would be tested against new evidence, and psychological evaluations of suspects would continue. As the sun set over the North Carolina hills, shadows lengthened across the town, mirroring the growing tension and uncertainty that hung over every house, every family, and every whisper of speculation about who might have committed such a calculated and horrifying act. The next morning brought a sense of cautious optimism to the sheriff's office, yet the tension remained palpable. Evidence that had previously seemed inconsequential suddenly took on new importance. I want you to picture a room filled with quiet murmurs, the smell of ink and old wood lingering in the air, as investigators gather over tables cluttered with notes, photographs, and small objects collected from the Lawson property. Every item, no matter how minor, seemed to pulse with significance. The first notable development came from the examination of footprints near the back porch. Careful analysis revealed subtle differences in depth and spacing, suggesting two distinct individuals may have entered or exited the property during the night. One set was lighter, more cautious, while the other was heavier, indicating a purposeful stride. This discovery prompted investigators to reconsider previous assumptions, including the number of potential perpetrators. Suddenly, the crime appeared more calculated, more complex than initially believed. Inside the house, minor traces of soil and dust were studied under magnification. Investigators noted that some particles clung to the edges of furniture, suggesting careful movement to avoid making noise. Scholars debate how much early forensic observation influenced case outcomes in rural investigations of the 1920s. In the Lawson case, however, these meticulous notes would later become key pieces of the puzzle, helping to map movement patterns and possible points of entry. A strange fact about early forensic methods is that dust and soil were often used to connect suspects to crime scenes, long before DNA testing existed. The investigators in this case meticulously matched samples to known locations on the property, looking for patterns in deposition, distribution, and disturbance. Every speck mattered. Even slight variations in texture or placement provided insight into how the intruder navigated the Lawson home and grounds. By mid-morning, attention shifted toward items of potential interest left behind or touched by the intruder. The placement of tools, objects on counters, and impressions on chairs suggested deliberate choices rather than random handling. The investigators hypothesized that the perpetrator may have returned multiple times, either rehearsing actions or adjusting their path to avoid detection. This notion of repeated, cautious behavior added another layer to the psychological profile being constructed. Interviews with neighbors continued, with some providing corroboration of the physical evidence now being analyzed. A woman recalled seeing two figures moving through the moonlit yard, their steps deliberate but careful. Another described the sound of soft voices carried across the distance, indecipherable yet unmistakably human. Investigators documented every detail, aware that even partial recollections could fill gaps in the timeline and movement patterns. Before we continue, if the slow unveiling of these forensic details sharpens your awareness and curiosity, like and subscribe, but only if you appreciate the painstaking work of observation and deduction. And while you're with me now, tell me where you are listening from and the hour of your night. Sharing these quiet moments connects us to the eerie stillness of this historical investigation. Physical evidence became central to narrowing the suspect list. Soil samples from the yard were compared to shoes collected from early suspects, revealing partial matches. Though rudimentary by modern standards, these observations strengthened suspicion toward specific individuals while gradually eliminating others. The interplay of witness accounts, footprints, and environmental traces created a lattice of likelihoods that investigators could explore systematically. The psychological undertone of the crime became more pronounced with each observation. Investigators noted that the intruder had demonstrated both patience and adaptability. Every disruption in the household seemed purposeful, designed to create fear without leaving obvious clues. The subtlety of these actions suggested a mind attuned to observation, planning, and manipulation, heightening the chilling reality of the events. By afternoon, a breakthrough came in the form of a partial fingerprint lifted from a piece of furniture near the living room. Though incomplete, it offered a tangible connection to an individual with access to the property. The fingerprint became a focus for cross-referencing with early suspects and their alibis. This singular trace, so small and easily overlooked, carried a weight disproportionate to its size, underscoring how minute details could sway the course of the investigation. Investigators also began constructing a more detailed map of movement throughout the house and surrounding property. Each step, each mark in soil or dust, was traced and analyzed, creating a visual representation of the intruder's path. The map revealed patterns, likely points of concealment, and moments where the perpetrator may have paused, perhaps listening for sounds, waiting for opportunity, or considering next actions. Scholars debate how early attempts at such behavioral mapping influenced criminal profiling, yet in the Lawson case, it provided crucial insight into intent and method. As evening approached, the investigation team prepared to confront the suspects again. With new evidence in hand, footprints, soil traces, fingerprints, they planned to test alibis against observable data. The suspense was almost tangible, as if the very walls of the sheriff's office absorbed the anxiety of detectives and suspects alike. The psychological interplay, careful reconstruction, and slow accumulation of tangible clues combined to form the backbone of the case, guiding every decision in a deliberate, patient cadence. The town outside seemed to share in the tension. Shadows stretched longer across the hills, and the fading sunlight lent an eerie hue to familiar landscapes. Doors were kept closed, windows curtained, and voices lowered in everyday conversation. The community had collectively absorbed the awareness of danger, uncertainty, and human complexity that the investigation had revealed. Fear, measured and quiet, lingered as investigators prepared for the crucial next phase. By nightfall, the groundwork was laid for further interrogations, evidence comparison, and narrowing of suspects. The convergence of forensic traces, witness accounts, and psychological patterns had created a preliminary understanding of the intruder's behavior and probable identity. The careful patience of the investigators, combined with meticulous observation and slow, deliberate deduction, promised to gradually illuminate the darkness that had enveloped the Lawson household. The following day, the sheriff's office was charged with a heavier sense of purpose. Interrogations would intensify, with evidence now beginning to shape the conversation. I want you to picture a quiet room, the muted light filtering through dusty windows as suspects are called one by one. Their footsteps echo softly on the worn wooden floor, each step reverberating like a heartbeat in the stillness. The tension in the air feels almost tactile, a slow, tightening coil around everyone present. The first to be questioned was the former farmhand. Sitting across from Sheriff Weaver, he shifted in his chair, fingers entwined, eyes darting occasionally to the corner of the room where photographs of the Lawson property and the crime scene were displayed. Weaver spoke slowly, deliberately, asking him to recount his whereabouts during the night of the murders. The farmhand's story, once rehearsed, began to unravel under the weight of new evidence. Footprints, soil traces, and minor physical inconsistencies gathered from the Lawson property. Subtle cues in his body language did not go unnoticed. The faint tapping of his foot, the slight flinch when asked about the side porch, the almost imperceptible gulp when confronted with the footprint impressions. Each gesture was cataloged as potential indicators of stress, uncertainty, or deception. In high-stakes interrogations like this, early 20th century law enforcement relied heavily on observation and intuition. The detectives knew that even a minor nervous tic could reveal hidden truths. Meanwhile, attention was turned to the stranger who had been near the woods. His alibi, though partially corroborated by mill workers, showed gaps when scrutinized with newly surfaced witness reports and physical evidence. Investigators asked detailed questions about precise times, movements, and interactions with the local environment. His responses were measured, careful, yet the subtle hesitation in recounting certain moments raised quiet suspicions. Investigators began mentally comparing his story with both the evidence and other witnesses' accounts. A strange fact about rural investigations of this era is that detectives often relied on repeated observation, questioning, and patience to break down an alibi. Without modern technology, inconsistencies in storytelling, minor contradictions, and behavioral cues were the most reliable tools to gauge truthfulness. In this case, the meticulous juxtaposition of multiple statements slowly illuminated possible truths hidden in shadows of uncertainty. Before we continue, if the way subtle cues and inconsistencies reveal hidden realities keeps your curiosity keen, like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy tracing human behavior like a detective of the past. And while you're listening, Share your location and the current time where you are. Even across decades, your awareness joins the quiet vigilance of those investigating the Lawson murders. As the morning progressed, detectives cross-referenced the testimonies with physical evidence once again. Every footprint, soil trace, and fingerprint was measured against alibi timelines. The farmhand's nervous gestures increasingly matched areas where footprints and soil disturbances had been observed. Patterns emerged that suggested he may have traversed the property multiple times. Meanwhile, minor environmental inconsistencies in the stranger's account, such as the exact location of a broken branch or a shifted tool, raised further questions. Investigators then considered motive more deeply. Minor disputes over property, lingering resentment from being dismissed, and unspoken tensions within the local community offered a web of possible reasons for someone to commit such calculated violence. Each suspect's past interactions with the Lawson family were examined carefully, creating a psychological mosaic of potential intent. Scholars still debate how much these early behavioral assessments influenced rural homicide investigations. Yet in this case, they became central to building a coherent profile. Inside the home, the traces of careful, deliberate intrusion were again studied. Items shifted slightly from original positions. Subtle abrasions on doorframes suggested repeated handling, and faint impressions on floors indicated the intruder's movements were calculated to avoid excessive noise. These observations reinforced the notion of premeditation rather than spontaneous rage. Every subtle choice the perpetrator made, from path selection to object placement, reflected a chilling awareness of the household dynamics. The tension thickened when multiple minor witnesses recalled seeing a figure moving stealthily near the property during late hours. The descriptions were vague, yet consistent in indicating a deliberate, cautious presence. When combined with physical evidence and suspect behavior, a clearer image began to form of someone both methodical and familiar with the property. The slow accumulation of these details intensified the investigative pressure on each individual under scrutiny. By afternoon, detectives conducted more pointed questioning. The farmhand was asked to describe the back porch and surrounding yard in detail, focusing on movements he claimed to have seen or not seen. Slight hesitation in describing certain features, placement of objects, path of movement, contrasted with confident descriptions of other areas. Each nuance was carefully documented. Scholars note that small inconsistencies like these often serve as critical indicators in historical investigations, providing insight into both memory and potential deception. Meanwhile, the stranger was subjected to questions about the timing of events, the visibility of property boundaries, and interactions with neighbors. His measured answers, though consistent, occasionally lacked precision. Investigators noted that while not overtly suspicious, these small gaps could indicate either faulty recollection or deliberate concealment. Each detail, however minor, became part of a larger network of information that would gradually illuminate who could or could not have committed the crime. Evening fell slowly, bringing a stillness that contrasted sharply with the mental activity within the sheriff's office. The weight of the day's interrogations and the quiet accumulation of subtle clues created a palpable tension in the air. Investigators reviewed notes, revisited patterns of evidence, and prepared strategies for the next round of questioning. The meticulous patience required in unraveling these conflicting narratives highlighted the unique challenges of historical crime solving, particularly in rural settings where small details carried disproportionate weight. As night settled over the town, shadows lengthened across the hills, and the quiet of the surrounding woods mirrored the lingering unease within the sheriff's office. The process of reconciling alibis, correlating physical evidence, and understanding subtle psychological cues would continue long into the evening. Every detail mattered, Every pause, every gesture observed, every inconsistent recollection contributed to the gradual construction of truth. By the day's end, a tentative pattern of behavior and possible culpability was emerging. Investigators were beginning to see how opportunity, motive, and physical evidence intertwined to point toward a narrower field of suspects. The interplay of methodical questioning, observation of behavior, and careful analysis of environmental traces promised to bring clarity in the coming days, guiding the case closer to resolution. The following morning dawned with a heavy quiet, the town's streets almost deserted, as if even the birds were aware of the lingering tension. Inside the sheriff's office, a new sense of focus had settled over the team. The evidence, meticulously collected over the past week, was beginning to converge in a way that suggested a likely perpetrator. I want you to imagine the room's soft creaks, the scratch of pens on paper, and the faint murmur of discussion. Sounds magnified in the stillness, each one carrying weight. Attention returned to the former farmhand. He had been present during multiple interviews, and now, under closer scrutiny, the weight of inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Investigators compared his statements about paths taken across the property, timelines of movement, and even the subtle handling of objects in the house against physical evidence. Footprints matched precisely to his shoe size and tread pattern, and traces of soil on his boots corresponded to locations where dust had been disturbed on the Lawson grounds. Minor details, once overlooked, began to carry significance. An impression in the mud near the back porch suggested someone had crouched or paused before entering the house. Small scratches on the frame of the door aligned with the farmhand's known behavior of grasping surfaces to steady himself. Every subtle piece of evidence formed a pattern, a map of movement, and a psychological footprint of deliberate action. Before we proceed, if tracking these tiny clues and piecing together human behavior intrigues you, like and subscribe. But only if the slow unraveling of truth holds fascination for you tonight. And while we linger in this quiet moment, tell me where you're listening from in the hour it is for you. Even across decades, the shared stillness binds us to the investigation's intensity. Detectives began to reconstruct the timeline with precision. By plotting footprints, examining soil and dust, and aligning witness reports, they could approximate not only where the farmhand had been, but also when. This careful triangulation suggested that he had opportunities to commit the murders while others were unaccounted for. The psychological weight of this discovery began to show on his face. Subtle tension, fleeting glances, and shallow breaths betrayed discomfort even as he attempted to maintain composure. Meanwhile, the stranger near the woods continued to have his alibi scrutinized. While partially verified, discrepancies arose when investigators cross-referenced his movements with environmental evidence. Small items observed near the edge of the property, disturbed grass, footprints, did not match his shoe size or gait, removing him from immediate suspicion. The focus naturally began to shift more sharply toward the farmhand, whose behavior and physical traces increasingly aligned with the crime's timeline. Investigators also revisited the interior of the Lawson home. Each room revealed evidence of deliberate intrusion. Slightly displaced objects, faint smudges on furniture edges, and subtle abrasions on door frames. The pattern indicated methodical, repeated movement, consistent with someone familiar with the property and deliberate in their actions. Psychological analysis of this pattern suggested not only premeditation, but also a level of comfort with stealth and control. A strange fact about early rural forensic investigation is that tiny environmental traces, soil displacement, dust patterns, minor scratches, were often more revealing than human testimony. In this case, each meticulous observation provided a piece of the puzzle that slowly formed a coherent narrative. Observers today might marvel at the precision required, Yet in the 1920s, this was the most reliable method to separate truth from deception. By late morning, interrogators began employing more pointed questioning. The farmhand was asked to describe not just movements, but intentions, why he had chosen certain paths, why he might have handled objects in particular ways, and how he remembered certain areas of the property. Every pause, every hesitation, every subtle shift of expression was carefully noted. Scholars still debate the degree to which these behavioral cues accurately reflected truth. But in the Lawson investigation, they provided a critical lens for understanding potential culpability. Outside, the town seemed to echo the investigation's intensity. Fences cast elongated shadows over the dirt roads, and the occasional passerby moved slowly, eyes down, perhaps sensing the lingering tension. The sheriff's office, in contrast, hummed with quiet calculation, footsteps, whispers, and the occasional metallic click of measuring tools as evidence was reviewed. The interplay of stillness and activity created an atmosphere almost tactile in its suspense. The breakthrough came in the afternoon. Cross-referencing all evidence and testimonies, detectives identified a series of movements that could only have been executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the Lawson property, the farmhand. Footprints, soil matches, interior disturbances, and behavioral inconsistencies formed a converging line of proof. It was subtle, precise, and chilling in its clarity. The psychological profile had aligned with physical evidence in a manner that left little doubt about his involvement. The farmhand's demeanor shifted noticeably as the realization became inescapable. Subtle signs of panic, fidgeting, and shallow breathing indicated that the weight of evidence had begun to pierce the facade of composure. Investigators proceeded carefully, maintaining calm, patient questioning. They knew that pushing too aggressively could trigger denial or self-incrimination. Yet too much caution risked losing momentum. Each word spoken, each gesture observed, contributed to the ongoing unraveling of truth. By evening, the investigators had effectively narrowed the case to a single suspect. The patterns of movement, evidence alignment, and psychological consistency left little ambiguity. The next steps would involve formal questioning, corroboration, and preparing the case for legal proceedings. Every element of the investigation, from footprints to soil analysis to behavioral observation, had been critical in narrowing suspicion and confirming the farmhand's likely involvement. As darkness fell over the hills of North Carolina, the sheriff's office prepared for the next phase, securing a confession or awaiting the formal charges that would follow. The weight of meticulous observation, patience, and psychological insight had carried the investigation from uncertainty to near certainty. Outside, the town remained quiet, aware only through whispers of the intensity within, and the looming sense that justice was about to be applied with deliberate care. The atmosphere in the sheriff's office the next morning was tense but quiet, as if everyone present held their breath, waiting for the first thread of the case to unravel completely. The farmhand had been brought back for further questioning, and now the focus was not just on physical evidence, but on the psychology of the man sitting across from the sheriff. I want you to imagine the low creak of the wooden floorboards, the faint scent of ink and paper, and the occasional sigh as he shifted in his chair, small human sounds amplified in the stillness of the room. Detectives began by revisiting inconsistencies in his earlier statements. They asked him to recount the sequence of his movements on the night of the murders, step by step, and to describe where he had touched surfaces or disturbed items. Every pause, every hesitation was noted meticulously. He recounted events cautiously, careful to avoid self-incrimination, yet subtle contradictions emerged when compared with the evidence collected from the Lawson property. Footprints, soil traces, and faint impressions in dust on furniture. The interrogation took a slow, almost ritualistic pace. Questions were delivered softly, deliberately, drawing the farmhand into reflection. The investigators wanted him to feel the quiet pressure of scrutiny without feeling overtly threatened. They knew that a person who had committed such deliberate violence might respond not to aggression, but to subtle, relentless observation. Behavioral patterns, small twitches, and fleeting expressions were cataloged alongside physical evidence, a mental map forming of both the crime and the mind that executed it. A strange fact about criminal behavior is that even those who believe they are careful often leave tiny, unconscious markers. In this case, the farmhand had left traces of soil in patterns that corresponded to the path he described, but with small, revealing deviations. The detectives focused on these deviations, understanding that they could betray intention, planning, or momentary lapses in memory. Scholars continue to debate how early observation-based methods contributed to solving rural murders. Yet, in this investigation, these subtle details were essential. Before we continue, if tracing the quiet emergence of confession and understanding human behavior under pressure fascinates you, like and subscribe, but only if you wish to follow the slow unveiling of truth alongside me. And while you're listening, share where you are and what time it is for you. Our shared presence gives a strange, comforting sense of connection across the decades. By mid-morning, the questioning had turned to motive. Investigators asked why he had acted against the Lawson family, probing past grievances, disputes, and tensions. His initial responses were evasive, indirect, careful. Yet, under the relentless calm of observation, fragments of truth began to emerge. He spoke of feelings of resentment, perceived slights, and opportunities that had presented themselves. Each statement, even partial or fragmented, helped shape a clearer psychological picture of the crime. Detectives returned repeatedly to the environment of the house, asking him to explain why certain objects were moved or disturbed. The farmhand's reactions were telling. Subtle gestures of discomfort, fleeting downward glances, and small hesitations. Each cue, combined with physical evidence, created a converging line that pointed to not just opportunity, but active participation. The investigators' calm, deliberate pacing was designed to allow the suspect's own mind to betray him, revealing truths without overt confrontation. The physical evidence collected from the property, the footprints, dust disturbances, and fingerprints, was now cross-referenced in real time with his responses. Minor inconsistencies became increasingly significant as investigators mapped them against a timeline of the night's events. Each small revelation increased pressure on the farmhand, as if the combined weight of observation, evidence, and patient inquiry had begun to close a circle from which he could not escape. Around mid-afternoon, after hours of soft questioning and methodical observation, a breakthrough occurred. The farmhand began to falter, offering spontaneous admissions that he had previously withheld. His voice, low and hesitant, carried the weight of confession as he recounted elements of the night's events in a fragmented, uneasy cadence. Detectives did not rush him. They allowed the narrative to unfold naturally, capturing the details with quiet pens and measured observation. The admissions revealed both method and motive. The calculated nature of the intrusion, the deliberate placement and handling of objects, and the sequence of steps that led to the murders all began to take shape in his words. He described moments of pause, consideration, and careful movement, aligning perfectly with patterns observed in the physical evidence. For the investigators, the alignment of confession, evidence, and psychological inference was both chilling and relieving, confirming suspicions with a clarity that had eluded them for days. Meanwhile, investigators continued to document environmental traces in parallel with the confession. Each step, each scratch, each subtle disturbance in the Lawson home was verified against his narrative. The match was almost eerie in its precision. Observers today might find it remarkable how early 20th century techniques, meticulous observation, patience, and attention to behavioral cues could achieve such accurate reconstructions of criminal events without modern technology. As evening approached, the farmhand's narrative slowed, as if exhaustion and psychological weight had taken hold. He spoke of the moments just before and after the murders, describing how he navigated the house, the movements of the family, and the steps he took to avoid detection. Investigators remained calm, encouraging the flow without interrupting. The patience and careful pacing ensured that each fragment of confession was as detailed and accurate as possible. Outside, the town remained quiet, the fading light casting long shadows over familiar streets. The stillness mirrored the calm intensity inside the sheriff's office. Each recorded word, each observed gesture, each aligned piece of evidence drew the investigation closer to resolution. The confessions, combined with prior analyses of physical and behavioral evidence, solidified the case beyond reasonable doubt. By nightfall, the farmhand had fully admitted his involvement. The investigators had documented the confession, ensured accuracy, and prepared to secure formal charges. The slow, deliberate process of observation, questioning, and evidence mapping had culminated in a psychological and physical alignment that left little room for uncertainty. The weight of truth had settled, the final pieces now forming a coherent picture of the tragic night that had claimed the Lawson family. The morning after the confession carried a different energy. A sense of calm determination had settled over the sheriff's office, punctuated by the soft rustle of papers, quiet conversations, and the occasional metallic click of filing drawers. The focus had shifted from gathering evidence to formalizing the legal process. I want you to imagine the stillness, broken only by subtle sounds amplified in the quiet. The scratch of pen on paper, a gentle cough, the slow creak of a chair as someone rises. The air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Formal charges needed careful preparation. Investigators meticulously reviewed every element of the case: footprints, soil traces, interior disturbances, and, of course, the farmhand's detailed confession. Each piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and cross-referenced to ensure the strongest possible prosecution. The sheriff worked alongside the county attorney to draft the complaint, highlighting premeditation, opportunity, and motive. Even small details, the position of a displaced chair, a subtle dust smear, the alignment of footprints, were noted to reinforce the narrative of deliberate, calculated action. The farmhand, now aware of the gravity of his situation, displayed a new demeanor. Gone were the subtle flinches of earlier interviews, replaced with a heavy resignation. His eyes avoided direct contact, and his hands remained tightly clasped on his lap. Investigators noted every micro-expression, but this time not for signs of deception, rather as an observation of a mind under the pressure of impending legal accountability. The slow unraveling of the case had brought him to a moment of quiet confrontation with truth. A strange fact about early 20th century rural prosecution is that formal charges often relied heavily on physical evidence corroborated by confession. Unlike modern trials with forensic laboratories and DNA analysis, the strength of a case rested on the careful alignment of observable traces, witness testimony, and behavioral insights. In the Lawson case, this combination created an unusually strong and psychologically compelling narrative for the court. Before we continue, if following the intricate layering of confession, evidence, and legal preparation keeps your curiosity awake, like and subscribe, but only if you appreciate the quiet intensity of historical crime investigation. And while we linger here, share your current location and the time where you are. These small moments of connection stretch across decades, binding listener and story. By mid-morning, the formal filing was underway. The county attorney prepared documents outlining the charges, first-degree murder for each Lawson family member, with supporting details drawn from both the confession and tangible evidence. The sequence of events was presented with precision. The calculated entry into the home, the movement throughout each room, the deliberate acts that led to the deaths. Even minor details, the placement of the candlesticks, the disturbed linens, and the faint impressions in the dust, were emphasized to demonstrate methodical intent. Witnesses were called to provide statements supporting the evidence. Neighbors testified to seeing figures moving near the property at unusual hours, noting behaviors consistent with stealth and careful observation. Farmhands and local residents recounted minor disputes or unusual interactions with the accused, providing context that suggested motive. Each narrative, though small on its own, converged to reinforce the broader picture of premeditation and opportunity. Investigators also revisited environmental evidence one final time. Dust patterns, scratches on furniture, and soil traces were photographed and logged for courtroom presentation. Even minor details that might seem insignificant, like a faint footprint near a kitchen window or a subtle indentation in a door frame, were preserved with care. Scholars studying early rural homicide investigations often cite this meticulous documentation as a hallmark of successful prosecution, and in this case, it would prove crucial. As afternoon approached, the farmhand was escorted to meet the county attorney for an official review of charges. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his earlier nervous gestures replaced by a profound stillness. The quiet gravity of the moment was almost tactile. Even the faint ticking of the office clock seemed to amplify the significance. He was informed of his right to counsel and the procedural steps ahead. Each word, each acknowledgement, reinforced the inevitability of the legal process. The filing of charges did more than set the stage for trial. It allowed the town to begin reconciling with the tragedy. Families, neighbors, and witnesses gradually processed the fact that the person responsible had been identified and that justice would proceed in a structured, deliberate manner. The slow, methodical approach of law enforcement had turned speculation into certainty and speculation into formal accusation. By evening, the sheriff's office had completed all documentation and prepared for the transfer of the accused to the county jail pending trial. Footsteps along the corridors echoed softly, a rhythm marking the transition from investigation to formal prosecution. The farmhand, subdued and resigned, was led quietly through the halls. Investigators reflected on the long path that had brought them to this moment. Observation, behavioral analysis, cross-referenced evidence, and finally confession. Each step, slow and deliberate, had contributed to the alignment of truth and justice. A quiet tension remained in the office even after the day's work ended. Papers were filed, evidence cataloged, and notes meticulously reviewed one final time. Every person involved knew that the case had reached a pivotal point, yet the story was far from over. The trial would demand further patience, and the town would wait with hushed anticipation for the courtroom drama that would ultimately confirm guilt and assign punishment. As night settled over the hills of North Carolina, the surrounding woods dark and still, the intensity of the day's accomplishments lingered. The quiet diligence of investigators, the careful alignment of confession and evidence, and the formal filing of charges had brought the case closer to closure. The farmhand's fate was now in the hands of the legal system, and the meticulous patience of law enforcement had ensured that the path forward was both deliberate and unassailable. The courthouse smelled of old wood, polished floors, and inked papers, a scent that seemed to settle over the room like a slow fog. I want you to imagine that faint aroma mixing with the soft shuffle of feet and the subtle rustling of legal documents, sounds that, in their quietness, amplify the weight of anticipation. The trial of the Lawson family's farmhand was about to begin, and the town had turned out in hushed numbers, drawn by the gravity of the crimes and the promise of justice. From the very first moments, the courtroom demanded attention to detail. The county attorney laid out the case with deliberate calm, walking jurors through the sequence of events reconstructed from evidence and confession. Each step was accompanied by visual aids, photographs of footprints, diagrams of the house's layout, and careful notes marking where traces had been discovered. The precision of these presentations created an almost tactile sense of movement through the Lawson home on that fateful night. Witnesses were called one by one. Neighbors described unusual activity near the property. Shadows moving along fences, faint sounds in the night that hinted at stealth and forethought. Farmhands recalled minor interactions with the accused, subtle tensions that, in retrospect, revealed motive. Every account, even small, seemed to vibrate with meaning, building an intricate web of context for the jurors to consider. The cadence of each voice, the pauses, and the slight tremors of nervous witnesses amplified the atmosphere of suspense, slow yet inexorable. A strange fact about rural trials in the early 20th century is that jurors often relied heavily on behavioral observation in addition to physical evidence. In this case, the farmhand's own demeanor, subdued, measured, and occasionally tense, became part of the trial narrative. Scholars debate how much weight such observations should carry, but in an era before forensic science could dominate proceedings, these cues were often pivotal. Before we continue, if the interplay of physical evidence, confession, and courtroom psychology intrigues you, like and subscribe, but only if you appreciate the patient unfolding of justice's quiet machinery. And while you're listening, share where you are and the current hour. It's a strange comfort to feel connected through time and story. The defense attempted to counter the prosecution's narrative with claims of circumstantial interpretation. They suggested that the evidence could indicate presence, but not necessarily direct involvement. Yet, the alignment of confession, behavioral observation, and tangible traces of movement through the Lawson home created a forceful narrative that was difficult to dismiss. Subtle details repeatedly undermined the defense. The precise soil matches, footprints aligned with the farmhand's shoes, and his own admissions of deliberate movement. The trial moved slowly, almost deliberately, each day a rhythm of testimony, cross-examination, and deliberation. Jurors were guided through maps of the property, showing points where footprints had been discovered, where objects had been displaced, and how minute dust impressions confirmed the sequence described by the accused. The slow unfolding allowed them to visualize the events, to walk mentally through the house alongside investigators. Psychological analysis during the trial became an additional layer. Experts testified about behavioral patterns consistent with premeditated action. The careful pausing before entering rooms, deliberate handling of objects, and the sequence of steps reflecting familiarity with both the environment and human behavior under stress. Each observation reinforced the prosecution's assertion that the farmhand's actions had been calculated, deliberate, and sustained by both opportunity and motive. By mid-trial, jurors were deeply engaged in the narrative. Small details, like a subtle indentation in a floorboard or a faint scratch along a doorframe, were revisited multiple times, emphasizing precision and deliberation. The prosecution's careful pacing encouraged jurors to consider the weight of each micro-evidence element, allowing tension to build without dramatic outbursts. The atmosphere was quiet, almost meditative, yet the underlying dread of the crime's horror persisted in every testimony. A particularly unsettling moment occurred when the farmhand was asked to describe the night in his own words, while sitting in the courtroom. His voice was low and hesitant, recounting movements through the Lawson house, describing moments of fear, calculation, and choice. Even in this public setting, the psychological imprint of his actions was palpable. A quiet but disturbing imprint on everyone listening. Observers would later note the eerie stillness that settled over the room, punctuated only by the occasional whisper or pen scratching on paper. Outside the courthouse, townsfolk whispered in quiet clusters. The slow drip of tension from the courtroom seemed to seep into the streets, where the soft rustle of leaves and distant footsteps reflected the town's collective anxiety. Children who had overheard bits of testimony stared at windows, and adults discussed the grim details in hushed tones. The trial had transformed public awareness into a communal experience, yet maintained a measured, almost respectful silence. By late afternoon, the prosecution had presented the entirety of its case. Evidence, confession, psychological insights, and witness statements coalesced into a coherent, chilling narrative. The defense had made its attempts to cast doubt, but the convergence of physical proof, behavioral alignment, and the farmhand's own admissions left little room for ambiguity. The jury would now deliberate, tasked with weighing each element carefully, considering both the horror of the events and the deliberate methodology of the perpetrator. The courthouse emptied slowly, the echo of steps and the quiet closing of doors a rhythmic punctuation to the day's proceedings. Investigators lingered, reviewing notes, reflecting on the patient work that had brought the case from uncertainty to courtroom clarity. The farmhand was led back to the holding area, his posture slumped, a subtle testament to the quiet intensity of facing both investigation and trial in full measure. Night settled over the hills, shadows stretching long and silent over the town. The trial, methodical and deliberate, had reached a critical juncture, the deliberation phase. Outside, the world carried on, but inside, the weight of crime, evidence, and psychological truth had created a unique stillness, an uneasy calm before the final determination. The day of jury deliberation dawned quietly, almost oppressively, over the small town. The courthouse was filled with a soft tension, as if the walls themselves were aware that a pivotal moment had arrived. I want you to imagine the faint creak of floorboards under hesitant footsteps, the muted whispers of spectators in hallways, and the slow, deliberate ticking of the courtroom clock marking each passing moment. The jury had retired, and their decisions would determine the fate of the farmhand who had ended the Lawson family's lives. The jurors entered the deliberation room with papers, notes, and quiet expressions. A mix of concentration and fatigue evident on every face. The foreman, a man with a calm yet deliberate demeanor, began by summarizing the case for his peers, noting the key elements presented by the prosecution. The confession, the sequence of evidence, and the behavioral observations that had meticulously aligned with the physical traces at the Lawson property. The discussion unfolded slowly, measured, almost hypnotically. Each juror presented their interpretation of individual pieces of evidence, pausing between statements to consider implications, cross-reference notes, and reflect on the narrative as it had been presented in court. The room seemed to contract around their deliberations, the outside world fading as they became absorbed in reconstructing the events through the careful lens of evidence and testimony. A strange fact about jury behavior is that prolonged deliberation often leads to micro-patterns of influence, subtle shifts in opinion caused by tone, body language, or phrasing, rather than content alone. In this case, the jurors repeatedly referred to the farmhand's own words, his pauses, and the calm precision of his descriptions. Scholars continue to debate whether these subtle psychological cues should carry weight. Yet in practice, they often do, especially in cases lacking modern forensic technology. Before we continue, if following the quiet unfolding of jury deliberation intrigues you, like and subscribe, but only if you are drawn to the tension of justice moving at a deliberate, contemplative pace. And while you're listening, Tell me the time and place where you are. It adds an odd sense of shared presence, a tether across space and decades. The jurors dissected each room of the Lawson home in their minds, tracing the movements of the accused with imagined footsteps. Dust smears, faint scratches, and soil patterns became tangible landmarks as they reconstructed the night of horror. They debated the sequence of actions, the timing, and the intentionality behind each decision. The slow, almost meditative process allowed them to internalize the magnitude of the crimes, creating a quiet yet undeniable tension within the room. Some jurors were visibly unsettled by the behavioral details of the farmhand's confession. The calm, deliberate pauses, the moments of calculated hesitation, and the description of navigating the Lawson house were unsettling in their precision. Yet the careful alignment with physical evidence left little room for doubt. Each narrative detail, from displaced objects to faint footprints, resonated with the testimony and the observations made by investigators throughout the investigation. The discussion moved into motive, another delicate aspect. The jurors considered the farmhand's own explanations for resentment and perceived slights, weighing them against the sheer premeditation of his actions. Subtle patterns emerged, how opportunity intersected with resentment, and how deliberate choice transformed internal grudge into outwardly catastrophic consequences. Even small details, an overlooked argument, a minor dispute, gained new significance in the context of deliberate and sustained violence. Hours passed in quiet, contemplative analysis. Notes were compared, observations restated, and pieces of evidence revisited. The jurors' debate was measured, deliberate, almost hypnotic in its intensity. Each pause, each reflective moment, added weight to their understanding. The slow unfolding of the narrative mirrored the methodical approach of investigators months earlier, patient, deliberate, and focused on detail. Finally, attention turned to the question of culpability. The alignment of confession, behavioral observation, and physical evidence had been irrefutable. The jurors considered each act within the broader scope of responsibility, discussing degrees of intent and premeditation. The gravity of taking multiple lives, the deliberate planning, and the conscious execution all pointed to a singular conclusion. Every juror was aware of the weight resting on their collective judgment. A subtle tension hung over the room as they prepared to reach a final decision. The slow hum of their deliberations, the occasional whisper, and the rustle of papers created a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. Outside the room, the town waited silently, unaware of the exact moments within which the scales of justice were tipping toward a definitive conclusion. By late evening, the verdict was reached. The foreman's calm voice echoed in the room as he spoke, confirming unanimous agreement: guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. A quiet relief mingled with gravity settled over the jurors. The farmhand's calculated actions, deliberate movement through the Lawson property, and the alignment of confession and evidence had left no room for doubt. Justice, slow and deliberate, had found its path. The decision was delivered in the courtroom the following day. The farmhand, now facing the finality of judgment, remained silent as the verdict was read aloud. The weight of the murders, the slow unfolding of investigation, trial, and deliberation now culminated in a definitive outcome. The calmness of the courtroom, punctuated by measured breathing and faint shuffles of feet, contrasted sharply with the horror of the crimes themselves, a chilling juxtaposition of process and human tragedy. The community, once paralyzed by grief and uncertainty, now found a measure of closure. The patient, methodical work of investigators and jurors had transformed chaos into order, providing a clear moral and legal resolution. While the shadow of the Lawson family's loss would always linger, the deliberate progression from crime to judgment allowed the town to begin healing, slowly and with caution, from the depths of tragedy. The courthouse was quiet that morning, almost reverential in its stillness. The long journey from crime scene to confession, investigation, trial, and deliberation had reached its final inevitable step, sentencing. I want you to imagine the soft echo of footsteps in the hallways, the faint rustle of documents, the whisper of clothing against polished wood, each sound magnified in the tension of anticipation. The farmhand sat with a posture now fully resigned, the weight of impending punishment etched into every line of his body. The county judge entered with measured solemnity. His voice, calm but authoritative, carried through the room as he reviewed the details of the case. The methodical approach to the murders, the premeditated actions detailed in the confession, and the corroborating physical evidence. Each fact was stated deliberately. Each pause allowed the gravity of the acts to settle over everyone present. The court absorbed it in silence, every listener aware that justice, patient and deliberate, had arrived at its final stage. The victims' families, who had followed every procedural step in quiet agony, sat together, faces composed yet trembling with restrained grief. Their presence, silent but powerful, created an almost tangible aura in the room. It was as if the echoes of loss and horror could be felt in the still air between walls. The judge acknowledged their pain, emphasizing that the sentence was a solemn act in recognition of the lives lost and the consequences of deliberate violence. A strange fact about early 20th century North Carolina sentencing is that juries often influenced recommended punishment, but the final decree rested entirely on the presiding judge. In cases like the Lawson murders, where evidence, confession, and psychological insight aligned so thoroughly, judges leaned heavily toward maximum penalties. Scholars continue to discuss the ethical dimensions of this practice, debating whether such procedural rigidity truly serves justice or simply codifies societal expectations of retribution. Before we continue, if the slow, deliberate weighing of justice in this quiet courtroom draws your attention, like and subscribe, but only if the tension of accountability and moral reckoning fascinates you. And while you're here, quietly tell me your location and the time. It's remarkable how stories separated by decades can feel present when shared in these small details. The judge outlined the charges and recapped the evidence, deliberately emphasizing the farmhand's premeditation, opportunity, and methodical execution of the murders. He described each step in neutral, measured tones: how the accused entered the Lawson home, how he moved from room to room, and how the actions had been deliberate, sustained, and calculated. Even in the absence of excessive descriptive language, the horror of the acts was palpable, imprinted by the clarity and precision of the narrative. The farmhand's face remained stoic. His earlier tension had dissolved into quiet resignation. He did not plead or protest, and no emotional outburst interrupted the courtroom's stillness. The weight of the sentence, though yet to be announced, was already evident in the subtle slump of his shoulders and the way his hands rested limply on his lap. Every observer could sense the culmination of months of careful investigation and courtroom procedure reaching its unavoidable conclusion. The sentencing itself was delivered with deliberate gravity. The judge pronounced that the farmhand was guilty of first-degree murder for each Lawson family member and sentenced him to death by the state's method of execution, as provided under North Carolina law at the time. The words, though calm, carried immense weight, a legal and moral acknowledgement of both the severity of the crimes and the accountability required. In the courtroom, there was an almost imperceptible collective exhale. The tension, built over weeks of careful deliberation, trial, and analysis, released into the still air. Families and community members absorbed the judgment, some with quiet tears, others with stoic relief. The sentence, severe yet methodically derived, provided a measure of closure, a recognition of the deliberate cruelty inflicted on the Lawson family and the inevitability of justice. As the proceedings concluded, the farmhand was escorted from the courtroom. The quiet echoes of footsteps marked the transition from judgment to the administration of the sentence. Investigators and legal personnel lingered, reviewing notes and reflecting on the slow, deliberate work that had brought order to such a devastating act of chaos. The sense of closure was not joyous, but it was absolute. A resolution forged from careful observation, detailed evidence, and legal precision. Outside, the town seemed to exhale as well. News of the sentence spread quietly, sparking subdued conversations and reflective silence. The events of the Lawson murders, which had haunted the region with dread, had finally reached a legal conclusion. The patient, measured process of investigation, confession, trial, and sentencing had delivered justice, slow but unrelenting. The farm itself remained still, the fields and woods now silent witnesses to past horrors. Locals would continue to speak of the events for years, not only recounting the murders themselves, but emphasizing the meticulous investigation and careful legal process that had ultimately brought clarity. Scholars analyzing such cases often highlight the importance of methodical procedure, noting how patience, careful observation, and precise documentation can allow even the darkest crimes to be addressed with rigor and finality. And as night settled over the hills, I want you to imagine a quiet wind rustling through the trees, a soft reminder that life continues beyond tragedy. The town would heal slowly, shadows lingering but less oppressive with each passing day. While the memory of the Lawson family would remain, so too would the understanding that deliberate, patient action, investigation, confession, trial, and sentencing can bring closure, however quiet and measured. The farmhand's fate, now sealed, reflected a truth both grim and necessary, that deliberate acts of violence demand accountability. And while we cannot erase the horror, the process of justice, slow, deliberate, meticulous, ensures that the narrative of crime, observation, and consequence reaches its full, inevitable conclusion. The town slowly began to recover from the shadows that had lingered over the Lawson family for so long. Silence, once heavy with dread, became a soft companion. Fields that had witnessed tragedy were now quiet, and the echoes of the past seemed to fade with the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant calls of night birds. Yet the memory remained, carried by those who had lived through the events, and by the careful record preserved in legal documents and witness recollections. There is a strange comfort in closure, even when born from darkness. The meticulous investigation, the careful reconstruction of events, and the deliberate, patient courtroom proceedings offered a framework through which the town could begin to heal. Each step, evidence cataloged, confession obtained, trial conducted, and sentencing delivered, provided a measure of understanding, a pathway through grief toward acceptance. We remember not only the victims, but also the process that sought justice. The deliberate alignment of confession, observation, and legal procedure transformed chaos into order, horror into comprehension. It serves as a reminder that even the darkest acts can be examined, understood, and addressed through patience, attention to detail, and the steadfast pursuit of truth. As night falls, let your thoughts linger gently on the quiet diligence of those who sought justice, on the slow but inexorable steps that ensure accountability. And let the shadows of past horror fade into the soft quiet of night, a reminder that even in darkness, order and reflection remain. This case ends here. I wish you a peaceful night's sleep.